The furry community changed in many ways throughout the 90s, and this would continue into the 2000s. As the internet became more developed, it became more widely available across the world. Furry fandom spread across the internet, connecting pocket communities that shared a fascination for anthros. However, after a few years of being the joke of the media, public knowledge of the fandom was much larger, and the perception was much less positive. Hello Furs from the web, my name is Scar, and this is the story of the internet age of furry fandom. Stay tuned. Furry fandom was founded at the local level, but in the 1990s, the rise of bulletin board systems, MUDs, and internet relay chat made it possible for the fandom to communicate online. Pockets of the fandom grew in different parts of the nation and the broader world. Furry, as we know it today, has a larger presence online than anywhere else. This wasn't a quick transition, as it took many years for the internet to develop into what we know today. As home computers became more common and affordable, internet became more mainstream. The bulletin board systems of old transitioned into forums. Artwork, which had long been a core aspect of the fandom, could be for the first time shared online more easily. Yerf, a notable furry archive site that featured exclusively safe for work and non-suggestive content, started in 1996 and would run until 2004. It attempted a return briefly in 2007 but fell apart a few months later. Furaffinity began life as an alternative to Sheezy art in 2005. Carrying over design elements from it and DeviantArt, but allowing much more freedom over adult content. Furaffinity is still the largest online community for furries, even if the forums today are kind of treated second class to the main website. Despite this, it helped popularize a blueprint for offering more upload formats than just images. Competition wouldn't spring up for a few more years, with So Furry in 2009, Ink Bunny in 2010, and Weasel in 2012. All of these are still active today, although don't always come as close to the FA giant. Arguably, the most infamous furry art archive is E621. Despite having a sister site that disables all adult material, E621 has become synonymous with the copious amounts of adult content it offers. E6 sprouted up in 2007, replacing a long line of previous website names from the last year. Beginning with What the Fur, a few months later the website rebranded as lols.net, then Sidechan, before finally becoming the E6 we all know and love. Today we have a variety of platforms for talking with other furries, with many catering to different audiences and different formats. Furaffinity's forums went live a few days before the main site did, and are an example of what would become standard for furry networking in the 2000s. Furnation is considered by many to be the oldest furry social network, and offered many of the same features modern furry sites do up until its death in 2009. Internet relay chat remained as an alternative up until modern social media. However, FurryMuck likely saw a good decline with new platforms like Second Life being able to step above the text-based limitations. Overall, there was a massive shakeup with the social platforms. Similarly, the rise of social media would overtake some of the furry-centric platforms later that decade and in the 2010s. Facebook, Tumblr, Twitter, and Telegram have all been popular platforms over the years. Furry Amino has provided an outlet for young furs, even if it has a couple issues. Anthrodex is a social media unique to furries, which is an open beta. While I doubt any of these will be able to completely dethrone furries' presence on traditional social media, they could find niche positions like the modern forums have, an alternative to the big social media sites. Furry fandom's diverse presence online and sheer size has led to many subcommunities, a fracturing of the once collected fandom. It was honestly inevitable after the internet arrived, as it had a significant influence on increasing the scale of the previously small furry fandom. Furry started out as an incredibly small community compared to the tens of thousands that make up the fandom today. While not an accurate measurement of the fandom's size, looking at the attendance of furrycons over the years, just how much furry has grown. The internet of the 90s served as a good tool to connect distant furries together and introduce the fandom to different people. However, it was heavily limited because of the price still associated with home computers. This was remedied in the early 2000s, with computers becoming so much more affordable. Much of the fandom's boom in the 2000s is because of this, as well as the media's coverage, which no doubt brought more attention, even if misguided. When furry first broke away from sci-fi and comic book fandoms, it was very much with an open spirit. The breakaway to room parties and eventually the first conference were major steps in establishing the new fandom as its own entity. Ever since the early days, furry has been identifiable for its inclusive nature. In many ways, most furries would be accepting or at the very least tolerant to interests, beliefs, and even kinks. The hug is the furry handshake was a quote once used by NBC, and besides the common greeting of fursuiters it references, represents how a lot of furries aren't afraid to welcome new people. The large rise in fandom membership strengthened the community in multiple ways. One example includes widening the range of fan work. Drawings in fursuits have long been identifiable examples, but animation, music, plushies, and even miniature sculptures can be too. Despite many of these being niches, each at least has several creators, some of which even offer commission services. Commissions have long been a staple of the furry fandom, and offer a way for people to make their own living. As the number of artists and consumers grow, the more the furry economy grows. The increase of fandom membership also led to a massive rise in furry conventions across the world. Some major conventions were in place before Y2K, such as Anthrocon and Eurofurence. Other big names for modern day have risen over the years since. Examples include Midwest Fur Fest in 2000, Megaplex in 2002, Furry Weekend Atlanta in 2004, and Texas Furry Fiesta in 2009. As of the time of writing, there was over 100 different conventions. It is worth noting that conventions do come and go over time, so the number regularly fluctuates. At the mercy of this reality is Conference, the fandom's first convention which died in 2003. On a brighter note, the staff would breathe life into Califer, which carried over many traditions until it bit the dust 2 years ago. The growth of the fandom evolved furry into what we see in the modern day. The internet played a major hand, opening the doors for many new people to join a mostly welcoming community. With the floodgates open so wide, infamous individuals were inevitably going to spill in. By Y2K, elitist individuals and pocket communities were not brand new. This flavor of drama had been felt before with the Take Back Our Fandom movement and the divide between fan and lifestyler. Although each differed in goals slightly, elitist movements would continue into the early 2000s. While each would ultimately fall apart, often comprised of hypocrisy and undefined borders, there were some people that believed they really did hold merit. Most of the aforementioned drama took place during the furry renaissance, an era that culminated with the rise of the burn furs. This is a video I have a dedicated topic on. In fact, it's one of my first. Despite showing its age, the video adequately talks about one of the most contentious time periods in the fandom history. For those uneducated, a person by the name of Squee Rat wrote a rant post talking about how they believed sexual aspects of the fandom were directly harming it. A job interview gone wrong after a portfolio containing anthro art eventually led to an attempted movement with an intent to whitewash sexual aspects from the fandom. An inherently flawed goal and complete lack of structure led to a disaster that most of the fandom shook its head at. An extreme counter called the Freezing Furs ultimately suffered similar issues, festering a culture that behaved no better. The entire debacle was dubbed the Great Internet Furry Flame War, marching on from 1998 to 2001. A movement known as the Burn Furs 2 arose a few years later in 2005. A distinct lack of content and documentation online leads me to believe this didn't gain nearly as much traction as its predecessor. A few years after, it changed its name to Improved Anthropomorphics to distance itself from the rough history of the Burn Furs. I would say this death was slow, but it's hard to even tell if it ever got off the ground. To my knowledge thus far, there haven't been any other major attempts to try and change the fandom dramatically, at least none with any weight, although other issues would propagate down the line, especially in more recent years. The Burn Furs did help kill the distinction between lifestyler and fan, a previously very heated debate. In the midst of the Flame War, there were several media pieces that portrayed furries in an overwhelmingly negative light. This is what I spent most of my last video talking about, and in the years after, the fandom would begin to feel the effects of what went so wrong. As discussed in the previous history video, attitudes towards the media were originally more dismissive than antagonistic. This changed once people started becoming more aware of how the public at large was digesting the information. CSI may have not been the worst offender, but it definitely became the smoking gun with its wide audience. It's gotten to a point where the CSI episode has become a meta meme within the fandom, among insults like "yiffin' hell." Laughing at furries on the media was still common throughout the 2000s. While it was not nearly as damaging as some of the first features, there was usually just enough gray area to keep the stereotypes in the fandom alive. In Furries vs. the Media, I covered many examples of media features that hurt the fandom's reputation. Doing the same would take away from the main theme of this video, but as the fandom size grew, so did the amount of press coverage. Looking at the timeline on Wikifur, there is a ton of examples of both positive and negative features, and it's spread into the online space. It is often interesting when people get involved with internet culture for the first time. It can be a bear hug of sorts, depending on where one winds up. Online, it is a lot easier to find yourself among unsavory people than it is in person. The obvious reason is the level of anonymity, even if not complete, that being online offers. More than likely, someone isn't going to jump through all the hoops to find you in real life just because you said something unpleasant. Going beyond that, reasons for cyberbullying can just be an extension of real-world counterparts. Sometimes the people are just trolls, who find it humorous just to make someone else feel misery. Furry fandom has ever since its debut online been a target. Bullies, trolls, and misinformed individuals who have all contributed into what would come to be called furbashing. Furbashing was a real issue once the World Wide Web came to fruition. With home computers being much more affordable, the number of furries had greatly increased. With the misinformation spread by the media, there was a lot of people ready to exploit it. Throughout the years, waves of hate that were driven toward furries led to a lot of isolation. This theoretically would help reinforce the online exclusive culture for many furries. While there is a debate over whether there actually is a furry closet, I argue there is. While it's not the same thing as the traditional closet, the misinformed nature of the general public made it difficult for people to express their interest in public. This holds true even today, especially for the large younger side of the fandom who might have issues simply telling their parents about it. Young furs are an entire discussion video in themselves, so I'm not going in depth this time. But the amount of anti-hater memes shed light on a generation of furries who grew up with this public attitude towards the fandom. Some people on the internet went as far as to create anti-furry, aka anti-fur specific websites. Vivisector, Crush Shift Destroy, God Hates Furries, and many more were built around critiquing aspects of the furry fandom in a variety of different ways. Other websites such as Something Awful, Kiwi Farms, and 4chan, in its early years, while not primarily focusing on furries, featured anti-fur subgroups. While some of these websites are defunct now, they were still examples of this eccentric fanaticism. One example that comes to mind is an article that was released around the time of Zootopia. It is important to know there is a difference between trolls and people who just don't understand. More often than not, if someone says something that implies a misunderstanding, it can be smart to give them a more accurate definition of the fandom. They might not always listen, but getting defensive or retaliating isn't going to get the fandom anywhere. The only way to change people is to educate them. Thankfully, furbashing on the internet is a fraction of what it used to be. You will find fewer people trying to go for the throat of the fandom, if any. The biggest issue facing the fandom today isn't from trolls. Rather, it's an issue that's rooted in the fandom itself. While inclusiveness became one of furry's most identified aspects, it's a double-edged sword that can cause issues for the fandom even today. Most furries do have a limit on what they will tolerate, including when it comes to people who will make decisions or mistakes that can harm furry's already fragile reputation. Furry is by far the most welcoming community you might come across, but at the same time, it has pockets that can turn into living nightmares. Learning how to navigate the fandom is something you learn over time, but if you get caught in the wrong communities, it can negatively impact your experience dramatically. This is only heightened with the continuous growth and division the fandom lives with over time. Drama has almost become synonymous with the fandom, especially in recent years. It's something that the fandom has been dealing with for an extremely long time. I personally believe it is a side effect of the fandom's inclusive nature and the sheer diversity of the fandom. So many times, drama of various kinds can be traced back to one or few individuals who have just spoken very loudly. The more people that associate with the fandom, the more common these become.
One of the ones that's thrown around a lot is people with an interest in anthropomorphism or anthropomorphic animals. That last one's pretty good, and that's sort of the one that most of the fandom sort of accepts. Of course, for psychologists, we like things difficult, so we're not using that one. For our research, we're very simple. A furry is a person who calls himself a furry.
Yeah.
He got a grant for this.
Furry's definition has always been up for debate, just because how complicated defining this fandom can be. While good drama can occur, I am talking about the incidents that result in very little positive change, if not negative change. Ultimately, drama is inevitable. There is nothing that can be done about stopping it. What can be done is the fandom can learn to mitigate incidents and try to avoid it where possible. Many incidents only fester because people engage in arguments rather than forming positive discussions. I don't care what the debate might cover, a healthier approach can always do more good. The United States is currently in one of the most politically charged times in history. This nation is a bit of a scary place to be right now, and a lot of politics have seeped into the furry fandom. With titles going around such as alt furry and Antifa furs, there has been more major divisions that parallel the late 90s. Politics have stirred a lot of trouble for the fandom online, and even in the doors of some conventions. This is the current era we are in, and unfortunately it has been brewing for most of this decade. My next furry history video will be my last timeline video, bringing us up to the modern day and talking about where we are headed for the future. Thank you guys so much for all the massive support. It is very likely my next furry history video will be the final one for this year, as production on my 2020 Christmas animation begins later this month. I plan on doing some reviews in the meantime to keep this channel flowing over the next couple of months. Do not fear, as once 2021 comes, there are plenty of ideas ready to begin production. Also join my Discord to stay up to date with updates and announcements. Until next time when I talk about the political war of the furry fandom, stay tuned.